I should say that what I'm going to say derives in part from both the projects that Hilary mentioned, from modelling, and from scrambled messages. And I've given earlier versions of this talk at various venues, including Strathclyde University, Oxford University, Caltech, at Senate House, and so on. It's work in progress. And one of the main topics today is going to be Burne-Jones. It's been proposed by Joan Richards and others that in the Victorian period, a shift was embraced by a generation of mathematicians investigating surfaces and higher dimensions, a shift from a prioritization of the abstract fixities of symbolic systems in algebra to an openness to the descriptive maneuvers of geometry, newly descriptive of a kind of space conceived of as annexed to experience. Questioning the universality of Euclidean laws, which were taken to rest on a fully abstract conception of space, the non-Euclidean geometry that was being developed involved the imaginative modelling of space in multiple dimensions. Just going to lift this up, I can't see too well down there. It's generally agreed that since Lewis Carroll opposed the dethroning of Euclid, he developed the nonsense worlds down the rabbit hole and through the looking glass in order to parody the excesses of the non-Euclidean geometry. However, in doing that, he undertook the same thought experiments that non-Euclidean geometers relied on, crossing over from abstract to concrete, literalizing. Jonathan Smith, in Fact and Feeling of 1994, showed that when the story of 1884 by Edwin Abbott, Flatland, is hilariously called Edwin Abbott, which is a very square name. And his nom de plume is A Square. But when this story that came out in 1884 was noticed in Nature, it was quite explicitly identified as being an exploration of non-Euclidean geometry. The reviewer in Nature saw that it referred to issues raised by mathematicians J.J. Sylvester, W.K. Clifford, and Hermann von Helmholtz. Challenges to Euclidean geometry emphasized difficulties in defining rules for parallel lines in cases where the surface was not flat, addressing the problematic case of two-dimensional geometry on surfaces that were not flat. If a surface was spherical, then a line on that surface would be curved rather than straight. Instead of being extendable to infinity, as Euclid would have it, this kind of straight line would meet itself if extended all the way round. Furthermore, on a curved surface, apparently parallel lines could meet each other. Beings inhabiting a surface would have to fit their geometry to their perceptions. Sylvester asked his listeners to imagine beings like infinitely attenuated bookworms in an infinitely thin piece of paper. Helmholtz gave the example of the sphere, then imagined beings confined to the surface of an egg and those living on a convex mirror. Flatland dramatized these propositions by elaborating the worldviews and social conventions of 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and even gesturing at the case of 4-dimensional denizens and positing the existence of ever-increasing dimensions. Smith points out that this new geometry raised a challenge to the idea that space was an absolute abstract category, independent of an individual's sense perception. Abbott's juxtaposition of social convention and local power politics with geometrical axioms in Flatland indicated that geometrical axioms were indeed conventions, just as contingent mores and local statutes are conventions rather than absolute truths. Wonderland, alongside the cover of Flatland, I have one of the Tenniel illustrations to Alice in Wonderland. Wonderland is a world where things toggle back and forth between flat and round, between sound and sense. It's a hyperdimensional space, often linked by commentators to that discussed in Flatland. I choose the term hyperdimensional with reference to Sarah Alexander's 2015 book, Victorian Literature and the Physics of the Imponderable. Alexander argues persuasively that the hyperconnective realist narrative takes three forms in response to the economic conditions of finance capital: the entropic slum narrative, the counter-entropic utopian narrative, and the hyperdimensional imperial tale. She notes a correlation between the flow and transparency, even invisibility of capital, and the new theorization of matter and energy in the Victorian period. In works such as Flatland, epitomizing the hyperdimensional imperial tale, beings from higher dimensions destabilize the assumptions of lower dimension dwellers. Upsetting her chronology a little, we can add Lewis Carroll's parodic invocation of hyperdimensionality. The illustration that you're looking at there on the left comes at the great debunking moment of Alice in Wonderland. She refuses to be intimidated by the characters that she knows to be nothing but a pack of cards. A few pages later, we'll learn that the shoot of cards is nothing but a handful of leaves blowing in the breeze as the young women rest on the riverbank. Alice speaks her debunking words caustically, but Tenniel shows her rocking back on her feet as the circle of cards flies round her. Her raised arm is not just exasperated, it's also defensive. The circle is completed by the pack of little animals darting away in alarm from her feet. In this depiction, her expanding size and commonsensical three-dimensionality bursts the world apart, and at the same time, a whirling, fragmenting, multidimensional world threatens her. Wonderland defies mapping. That which should be flat, the croquet ground, is ridged and furrowed. Those elements which should mark fixed points on the area of play, the croquet hoops, are mobile, since the doubled-over playing card soldiers unbend, stand up and walk about. The unidirectional strings of propositions that underpin logic and are fundamental to Euclidean geometry are rendered useless in a situation where reversal is allowed and meaning flows across barriers of identity by means of homonyms, puns, and visual resemblance. These characteristics have been discussed recently by Elizabeth Throesh and Gillian Beer. Hypostatization occurs as the meanings associated with homonyms take tangible or even animate form. At the end of the story, the return to waking consciousness and the return to the familiar everyday world reveals that the entire zone of Wonderland was, in fact, a case of the sounds like being materialized. Sheep bells that sound like rattling teacups produce the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the lowing of cattle, the sobbing of the mock turtle. So, where sound has priority over sense, the beings and experiences of Wonderland are generated. I want to suggest that the hyperdimensionality summoned up by Carroll for parody and referenced in visual terms by Tenniel, was also a resource called upon by fine artists as they approached the paradoxical relationship between ornamental flatness and illusionistic depth in the context of aestheticism, and developed challenges to a world view based on moral precepts and sequential narrative, focusing instead on embodied experience. Millet's Autumn Leaves of 1856 ushered in the period of painting without a subject, and it creates a nonsense world of geometrical unmappability in the heap of leaves. Simeon Solomon's Love in Autumn of 1866 positions the figure of Amor in a whirl of autumn leaves driven by gusts of cold wind. The seasonal reorganization of the physical environment leaves the subject lost and defenseless. Amor is converted from a mythic, purposeful agent to a subject only defined by his capacity for experience. We can take this argument really quite extensively across a range of late Victorian work in aestheticist mode, and start to think about the treatment of space, the role of the flat, and issues of relationships between dimensions. In The Wheel of Fortune, a motif developed by Burne-Jones from 1870 onwards, the giant figure of Fortuna stands by her wheel, its axis aligned with her hip. We can see an analogy between the stance of Fortuna and that of Alice the debunker. However, Fortuna shows none of the emotional affect of the figure of Alice. She turns her wheel with closed eyes, not angry, not fearful, subjecting the individuals attached to the rim of the wheel to relentless motion of the bronze rim. The pain and terror is all allocated to the creatures on her wheel, slave, king, and poet, mysteriously welded into the surface of the metal, splayed and vulnerable, something like the stretching frogs and ducks of Tenniel's illustration, or the attenuated bookworms that Sylvester asked his listeners to imagine. The monumental oil version of this composition, now at the Musée d'Orsay, was started in 1875 and exhibited in 1883 at the Grosvenor Gallery. It makes a study of the knots and sharp creases of the metallic drapery of Fortuna, geometrically perplexing in the way that the stack of bonfire leaves are in Millet's picture. We're allowed to imagine that her iron drapery is cast, hammered, and fused industrially in the same way that the brass spokes and hub of the wheel were fashioned. How many swathes of cloth are brought together in the knot hub at her waist? The wheel's spokes stretch from a triangular flatness to become knife-edged. This is just what is seen in the drapery of her sleeve, where her arm is raised. The ambiguous Piranesi-like architectural space with deep chasms, archways, and alleys is unreadable too. Little points of light indicate two distant openings in the framing structures, one way down below Fortuna's feet, another at the side, just by the loins of the king. Will the wheel crush its rim inhabitants, or merely hang them in an abyss. This picture surely invokes the hyperdimensional. Fortune consigns mortals to a surface existence, rhythmically arranged on a surface, history converted to ornament. The flat land of the wheel rim is a place where the denizens wriggle and squirm. This two-dimensional version of mortal life is inserted into a form environment where topological transformations can occur, inhabited by the giant allegorical figure in the picture as a whole. The conventions of dimensionality come under extreme pressure. Dodgson, the mathematician, invented a world in Alice where, contrary to Euclidean assumptions, large and small can be identical with long and short, appropriately for a flat world confined to the surface of a playing card. It takes him to the non-Euclidean field of topology and projective geometry, where neither shape nor size is the defining feature. Entities could be considered identical so long as the number of openings in a continuous surface remain the same. In topology, stretching and talking are envisaged, but the entity is considered to be topologically identical so long as no cutting or piercing occurs. Topologically, to give you an example, a 1-inch diameter ring for a finger is identical to a 20-foot long drain pipe. Moreover, a teacup like that balanced on the Mad Hatter's finger is identical to a torus or ring like the rabbit hole, having just one opening. Where topological qualities are the defining characteristics of an entity, knots become extremely important. The mathematician Peter Guthrie Tait was motivated to explore different forms of mathematical knots. And I'm going to move on one slide here to show you a page from one of his scientific publications. He was motivated to explore different forms of mathematical knots by physicists' assumptions in the mid to late Victorian period that the fundamental particles of matter were closed knots of ether in motion. However stretched or distorted the structure of each kind of knot, however stretched or distorted the structure, each kind of knot was identifiable, thereby accounting for diversity in the elements of the material world. The simplest knot is the trefoil knot, and after that the knots increase in complexity according to the numbers of crossings, or as Tait describes it, the degree of knottiness, beknottedness, or knotfulness. He established what was essential to the knot, differentiating it from other knots, looking at each knot in terms of its simplest projection. Part of Tait's project was to calculate for each kind of knot the minimum number of cuts and rejoinings necessary to reduce the knot to a simple circular loop. In investigating knots, mathematicians also turn their attention to other forms of connection, plaits, and linked or laced forms. Burne-Jones focuses not just on spaces, but on knots, admittedly not presented as the closed knots of a mathematical diagram, but mysterious in construction, partly because of the welded together appearance of the drapery. As he developed the subject of the Wheel of Fortune through many versions and studies, the knots became more and more important. Fortuna's headdress moves from an intricate plaiting of hair to a sober, wrapped and pinned affair to something outrageously knotted in a sinuous, bulging knobble. As you see, there in the photogravure. Burne-Jones's picture was welcomed by the theologian Peter Taylor Forsyth in his publication Religion in Recent Art of 1889. He welcomed it as a terrifying warning vision of the embrace of agnostic positions associated with recent developments in scientific thinking, giving in to inevitability in mortal affairs, and giving in to the position of thermodynamic theory positing the death of the sun, the erasure of difference, and the end of the habitable world is, in Forsyth's terms, an acquiescent, worldly, and agnostic creed, the holding of which was more dangerous than any kind of sin. Such a creed as this, he says, means at last ruin of the entire human nature by the cooling down of its central sun and slow extinction of its trusting life. But did Burne-Jones invest his vision with this kind of minatory value? Or did he subscribe and actually rather delight in the chill vision of powerlessness, cold bronze, and ruined habitations? We can't imagine Dodgson's style parody of the extremes of non-Euclidean talking and overthrow of logic in Burne-Jones's touching on these themes. But it's worth noting that this topic was developed as part of a series in which fortune is successively overthrown by fame, oblivion, and love. There's no hilarity in the set of scenes where corpses litter the ground, but in these successive overthrows, love triumphs. Love is a kind of central sun that comes to the fore amid the violence and the loss. The proposal by Tate, with his co-author Balfour Stewart, in The Unseen Universe of 1875, that beyond the inevitabilities of our doomed world, other realms with subtly different physical principles exist which can capture the degrading energies of our world, has some resonance in relation to Burne-Jones's mise en abîme. My argument has been that the parodic exposure of non-Euclidean worlds by Carroll shares much with the earnest exploration of stark mental and sensory experience in the imaginary worlds summed up in aestheticism. In those worlds, mutability, shape-shifting, and hyperdimensionality held sway.